When you get feedback from your team or a member of your team that we need to communicate better, what do you do? The most common mistake is to assume this feedback is about communication skills. How your team communicates with each other, well, it's a symptom of your team dynamic. It's usually not the cause of an unhappy team. Today I'm sharing a 3-step framework that will support you in uncovering what's really going on. Address the root cause, and how your team chooses to communicate with each other will magically improve. Let's get started, shall we? Well, hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the Project Joyful podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Tutty, your medical herbalist and high performance coach. So, hey, Project Joyful isn't just about being happy. It's about consciously creating a life you love. It's about remembering how to reconnect with your soul-centered joy. You know, that joy that comes from doing what you love, from living on purpose, and from being in a life that allows you to experience deep joy moment by moment. So hey, let's get started, shall we? I'm always curious when I work with a team who feels they need to communicate better. If this is the reason for your team's dysfunction, then working on communication skills is unlikely to improve the dynamic of your team. Why? Well, there are 2 main reasons. Firstly, the idea of improving communication is amorphous. There's no structure to it because, well, we're human, we're unique. We have different needs and wants, and to layer another level of complexity, our backstories add different flavours to our needs and wants as well. What does it mean for how we communicate with each other? Well, communication and what constitutes great communication is likely to mean one thing to me and another thing to you. The second reason is often hidden and it runs deep. Great communication, or the lack of it, is a symptom of how well our team is gelled. It's not the cause of the tension within your team. You see, if there's an environment of caring, mutual respect, and a collective desire to get the job done, well, this shows up in how we speak to each other. If I'm genuinely interested in your perspective, I'll stop, I'll be present, and I'll invest the time in actively listening to you. How am I likely to respond if I'm not interested in your perspective? I'm likely to come across as condescending, or I'll ignore what you have to say, or I'll talk over you. The classic signs of poor communication, but the core issue isn't the communication itself. Addressing what's really going on in your team is harder. It requires observation and evidence-based, courageous conversations. It's much easier to do a half-day course on not talking over each other. But let me ask you this question. Can you tell when somebody is outwardly doing the things that the rules of communication require, but inwardly they're just not interested? Yes, you can. We call it being authentic or building trust. That communication course is as effective as putting a band-aid on a severed artery. So what can you do when your direct reports say, we need to improve our team's communication? It starts with clarity. A team-based conversation around what you all like about how you currently communicate and what could be done better. There's also an education piece in this conversation where each member of your team talks about how they like to be communicated with and what they don't like. And this is where your knowledge of your team's learning styles can be helpful. So before going around the room, talk about the communication preferences for somebody who is predominantly visual or auditory or kinesthetic. And this will help your team to frame their communication preferences. Agree a visual cue that lets others know when they're deep in concentrated effort and don't want to be disturbed. And ensure everyone's clear about what that signal is, when it's used, and where it can be placed, so people know to look for it. For example, you could put a toy car on top of your computer screen. Now, as the manager of that team, notice who's using it and when they're using it. You see, the purpose of the toy car is not so that it can be placed permanently on top of your computer screen or desk partition. saving you from ever having to interact with your team again. Now for the courageous part. Watch and listen. Notice when an interaction within your team goes well. What is it about that interaction that's working well? When there's an appropriate moment, provide feedback so they know to do it again. This feedback can be public so that they get to feel good about it and they feel singled out for all the right reasons. And also, more importantly, other members of your team get lots of examples of what a great conversation looks like. It also helps to shift the collective team thought from "we're terrible at communicating" to something more helpful. Now, for those not so great conversations, this is a coaching moment. It's done in private and close enough to the conversation so that it's still fresh in the mind. This is your opportunity to get underneath, uncover the thoughts behind the conversation for both parties, and begin the process of reparation. This is a space of no judgment. Remind yourself that it's just data about a particular behaviour. It's never personal. It's never identity-based. Simply work in progress to help us get better as a team. The final piece of this communication puzzle is the checking in as a team. At each team meeting, reference the team's collective opinion on what great communication looks like and compare it to the communication that's been taking place since the last meeting. And ask your team if there's something new that's now ready to be added into that list. Check in with your team to discover what they need from you. How are you relaying top-down messages to your team? How are you sharing consequences of feedback they've provided to you ahead of the management team meeting, for example? And when your team tells you the communication isn't working, it's an opportunity for real lasting change. It's a gift. Don't downplay it and slap yet another communication workshop on the issue. Go deep. Get inside the issue. These requests for help are very rarely about the skill of communication. Sending you lots of love. Bye for now.
Hey, thanks for listening to today's podcast. Can I ask you a favour? If our conversation spoke to you today, could you please take a moment to leave a 5-star review? Your review will help people discover this podcast, and together we can create a world where there's even more love and more laughter. And if you want to hear more from the Project Joyful podcast, just click the subscribe button. Bye for now.